Thank you, Hong, and thank you, Mion, for the opportunity to do this. I'm going to start off with a little brag because literally a minute ago, and I mean a minute ago, we found out that E+D was part of an ASLA Professional Award for work done down with Mahan Raikeel in the Baltimore Harbor with dredge island reclamation, including some wetland stuff. So a little brag to start off the session. So thanks for that. You need to know a little bit about me to understand where ecology plus design comes from. Hong did let you know that I'm a wetland ecologist by training. I have a Ph.D. in zoology, and I take some perverse pride, I suppose, in being able to tell everybody that I have never had any course whatsoever that was ever in this college other than the ones I teach. So to go back to, for those of you who watched Bill Doan and Alka Bose earlier today, Bill talked about new ways of thinking and working with those in the arts. I've had the distinct pleasure of learning new ways of thinking because I'm working with those in the arts and design settings, coming from a strictly science background, and it has changed the way I think. And I thank my colleagues for their patience over the years in that. Let's see if I can get this to work. That's not going to work. There we go. So to get at what Bill was talking about in terms of understanding how others think in the arts and design fields as opposed to sciences, I have assembled a really good team, I think, of folks that work with E+D, our new center. From Leanne Andrews will be here in the spring. Lisa DeRussell, who was here working with us, but has moved to the University of Michigan. She's now our Western and Great Lakes representative. Our terrific RA right now, Alex Keim. Lisa Aiello out of Architecture and the Hamer Center. Kendall Mainzer out of the college. Stephen Mainzer here in Landscape Architecture. Doug Miller from Ecosystem Science and Management. Nathan Regner from Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. Peter Stempel, who is our new co-hire, which Malika talked about earlier. We were the first, I think, in the college to get a co-hire out of the Institutes of Energy and the Environment. I'm really excited about having Peter here. Derek Taft from PRTM, and of course, Hong from Landscape Architecture, all bringing together both design, backgrounds and interests, as well as some ecological interests to bring together what we talk about, which is E+D, ecology plus design. So this started with me and my, I guess, frustration as I wandered around the landscape and seeing human-made systems and looking at that wetland up in the upper left-hand corner that is nothing more than a pond with cattail around it, and wonder why we have to have that instead of that beautiful, and this is actually a designed mitigation wetland on the right. Why do you have the one and not the other? If you can go around the United States and you can see things with wetland mitigation, they all look like that picture with the pond and the ring of cattails. We call them in the business, we call them duck donuts, because that's really all they are. And they do not reflect the natural variation of that nature can put in the landscape. So I get more and more frustrated with seeing things like this and wanting to do something about it. And then we have things like what happened with Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Superstorm Sandy, a decade later. I show you here Staten Island. And if you remember, the impacts on New York were substantial, including Staten Island. And the western part differed in its impacts than the eastern part. The area in the circle still retained a lot of natural infrastructure. In other words, a lot of those freshwater wetlands and tidal wetlands. They had almost no impacts from from Superstorm Sandy, whereas the rest of Staten Island was devastated. The same thing could be said, or unfortunately should have been said, about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, but those natural wetlands that used to be buffering the coast of Louisiana were largely gone or sliced and diced by human activity. And so I get more frustrated with this kind of thing and seeing it and going, there really has to be a better way to design how we live such that we work with the ecology of a site and not against the ecology of a site. And so in 2016, Eliza Pennypacker, our department head, had some additional funds, and she asked for ideas, what to do with that. And I came up with the idea of a center that would integrate both ecological principles and design principles on the landscape. And that was the birth of E+D, Ecology plus Design. And our mission, as it turns out, is what you see here and what was in the title, which was Research Activated Design Intervention that seeks to significantly improve the ecological health of the design world. Right? Working with nature and not against nature. And that's our sort of our driving philosophy of E+D. So there's some goals that we have here, and Hong talked about these already, but I want to go through them here again because I think it's important to remember. So we talk about research, which we're going to try to facilitate some of those interdisciplinary projects that test the performance of design in the built environment. Ultimately, we want to, and we're going to continue this, actually, something we've got going right now. We have a podcast series, and so we're going to continue that podcast series and conferring with designers and ecologists on that topic of ecological design. We will have our next interview with a landscape architect by the name of Ginger Woolridge next week, and that will make the web, I don't know, hopefully within a month or so after that. And then something that is aspirational at this point, but we're working toward it, which is the development of a graduate option as well as a certificate in E+D. COVID has sort of gotten in the way of a lot of things, and that's one right there. So we started actually in 2017. We had some monies from Eliza. We got some monies from the Hamer Center and the Ecology Institute and IEE. And we were able to begin almost 3 years ago now with the first symposium. Our initial plan was that this was going to be something that we would have every other year. I'll get to the transition of why we didn't do that here in a minute, but basically it was our inaugural, hello to Penn State. Here we are. This is what we want to do. And we had several featured speakers, including Hong, that was here. Both landscape architects, planners, designers, ecologists all came in for a one-day symposium that is, we've been recorded and is now available on the web, and I should have that link in front of me, but I do not. We had an enormous, we did this on Facebook Live and had, I forget what the numbers were, but an enormous number of people that tuned in to take a look. It became fairly clear after this that it was difficult to continue this, which is what led to the idea of the podcast. That came from some of our members of E+D that why don't we try to do a podcast, and over time, essentially saving these podcasts would develop itself into a permanent yet virtual symposium. And so we're in the process of season 1, if you will, of putting these podcasts together. These are the folks that came through for the symposium, early on, and you can see the range of experience, both academics and practitioners. And this is the same kind of academic and professional expertise that we're targeting in the podcast. And so you can see here that this is not all of them at this point, but we have a few, including Jack Dangerman from Esri, talked about GIS, Emily McCoy and Keith Bowers, both landscape architects and designers, but also strong ecologists in their approach. And so we're trying to basically bring that virtual symposium, if you will, to life over time. We really got a big boost when we were awarded in one of the Penn State Strategic Planning grants in round one. And within that grant, we had several things that we were going to do. We had many grants. In other words, we were going to support people who did work that encompassed both ecology and design. We were going to have those symposia, which we've now transferred into a podcast series, going to develop that certificate. And then something that was really not in the grant itself, but something was aspirational, was to have more faculty that have this kind of expertise. And that turned out to be something that worked out with Peter Stempel and the IEE co-hire. So just a little background of the productivity that we've done over the last 3 years, just to give you an idea of where we're going. And I'll talk a little bit more detail of some of these later. Had 9 refereed papers, including that symposium, a lot of reports, a lot of conference presentations, including many that were canceled, unfortunately, at both CELA and ASLA due to COVID. We've had several of our faculty get grants. Hong got another strategic planning grant to look at stormwater issues. And this does not include our participation in a $3 million NSF training grant, Landscape U, that Erica Smithwick directs out of geography. We are a full participant in that. And there is an architecture graduate student currently involved in that. Supported several mini grants, talk about some of those. We've been involved in some of the classes in terms of trying to bring in some of the concepts, print reviews and those kinds of things. And we've had 3 graduate students that have been advised under this particular approach. So I feel it's not bad for 3 years, and we're going to keep going. One of the major projects was something we had never planned on. And this came out of the blue in 2017 or 2018 when President Barron contacted Eliza and said, we've got this property off campus, 355 acres. We would like somebody to take a look at it to give us some guidance and advice on what might happen with it. And for those of you familiar with State College, this is the Musser Gap area toward the south of town. And we called this MG2V, or the Musser Gap to Valleylands project. And it came into Penn State, and we turned it into a couple courses and a research project. So President Barron's vision was this: to help protect local water supply, plant and animal species, and places where people can enjoy nature and be inspired. And it cuts across the valley. This is the Slab Cabin Run watershed, and it cuts across the valley from farmland, which you can see there on the center, and just cuts up into the forest on the ridge, which you can just barely see on the right. It's a very complex piece of land. So we turned it into 2 quasi studios. The first one was basically an assessment of what's there, and these were students from not only landscape architecture, but soils, fish and wildlife. We intentionally looked for students from a variety of areas, because landscape architecture is interdisciplinary by nature, right? And we're trying to find people with expertise that could help us understand the site. The second phase was in the spring, where we brought in a lot of the local communities, because one thing we insisted on before we agreed to do this project was that there would be a lot of local interactions. We wanted to know what the folks in the area wanted out of this property. And you can see these preliminary drawings in the bottom here. It's a very complex piece of property. It's not nice and square. And there are developments to the north of it, including a proposed park. And then it goes all the way down to butting up against Rothrock State Forest. So we had these community conversations in the spring and several meetings, and the students were still working up on these ideas. So there are a variety of areas that are things that they looked at, from water resource protection to habitat creation to just keeping it in agriculture, right? It's an important agricultural component of the region, and we wanted to make sure that that was not forgotten. So the major ideas were more trails, south of Route 45 there to reforest because it's poor soils and not really good for ag. We want to convert that back to forest. Because it crosses a major road, there was some safety issues. We had to consider that. And again, what do you do next to a very large 100-acre park in the north that's going to be coming? And so the two options are basically keep it in all ag or remove some ag. And so that was the two things. And we had a major event with the public at the end that presented some discussion and some alternatives, and President Barron was there. And we had also obviously talked with all the administrators on campus and got their views in terms of the designs and so on. And it led to my final report earlier this year of, what all this meant just in terms of our analysis. And they put it out to bid. And the winner was going to be Biohabitat's Andropogon. Had a really nice bid package that they were going to then do a full assessment, something that the students could not do. And then COVID hit. So right now we are sort of stopped. The plan is, our plan is in place, our recommendations are in place. Biohabitats and Andropogon, assume are just waiting to go forward with that, but it's on pause, as a lot of stuff is with COVID right now. Now, I want to take you through a few of these mini grants real quickly, just to give you an idea of the breadth that we're looking at. We have Travis Floor and Mehdi Harris looking at urban forest patterns on surface temperature mitigation. In other words, looking at ways to mitigate that heat island effect that you're going to find in an urban setting. And this is down in Baltimore. We funded that. In architecture, they're looking at memorializing Centralia, the ever-burning fire. That's, for those of you not familiar with Centralia, it's in eastern Pennsylvania, and the underground coal has been burning, I think, since the early 60s, and they're doing an analysis of that, including the environmental and design aspects, which is what we're asking for, ecology plus design. Within, this wasn't a mini grant necessarily, but some other aspects of things we're looking at. I personally view ecology plus design at a variety of scales, from what we would call the site scale, fairly small, to regional. And this is one where Stephen Manger, myself, and Travis were looking at what we call DDREAM, which is deep decarbonization of renewable energy in the Appalachian Mountains. How to get the Appalachian Mountains off of the coal diet and into more of a renewable energy, but then looking at how that can happen with governance at the local level. And it's, as you can imagine, it's extraordinarily complex. Another grant that we funded was actually to look, this is an ecology grad student, to look at using native wildflower seeds in surface mine restoration. So again, I'm looking at design writ broadly here. I'm trying to manipulate the landscape here. And if you're familiar with most surface mine reclamations, they are often nothing like what was there before. It was typically forest, it's mined and then seeded over with grasses, often non-natives. And so what we tried to do was to see whether or not we could bring in native wildflowers, which might help mitigate some of the soil conditions and maybe ultimately bring back a more typical community, both ultimately maybe a forest, but also some of the pollinators that come along with that. And she found that, surprisingly enough, these seeds that we planted actually came in better without any of the organic amendments that were added. That one is currently in review with Restoration Ecology. And just to toot my own little horn a bit, I entered the realm of landscape architecture and talking about created ecosystems and the concept of succession. This gets at my complaint, I guess, many years of griping about how We look at how projects go through ecological succession or don't. And so I was able to get this earlier this year in Landscape Journal. Other mini grant projects, Lisa DeRussell was working again with Mahan Reichel on some urban meadow systems down in Baltimore. Hong is looking at green water infrastructure. Malika and Hong are working with a graduate student of mine on canal systems in Calcutta. And there's Hong again also working at looking at case study investigations on landscape architecture practice. We funded all of those. Here's some of the classes we've been involved with, just as a list there, just to show that we've done that. And we are trying to get some of those grants and contracts that Malika and Bill talked about. The most recent one is Travis. I'm on there as a help, but it's mostly Travis with the National Park Service looking at recreation and use and impacts to cliff resources. Mm-hmm. One of the exciting things, to me anyway, is our involvement with folks down in communications and sciences, as well as the Belisario School of Communications, on looking at how to get a collective identity among stakeholders in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we have, if Bill's still on, I can't tell, we are working with the folks in the liberal arts. I think it's a really exciting connection. And there's Hong's planning grant there, and other things that we've got, including that $3 million grant, of which E+D is a part. So a couple of things we're actually trying to get. Peter Stempel and I have put in for a Coastal and Estuarine Research Foundation coastal design competition. We won't find that out until early November, but it is working with a community down in coastal Virginia on trying to get them to adapt to issues relative to sea level change and sea level rise. And Peter's got a great amount of experience coming out of working in the coastal Rhode Island and visualizing some of the impacts. So we hope that that will turn into a studio in the spring, we hope. And then we're also going after one of the Huck's Innovative and Transformational Seed Funds, the HITS funds. I want to look at large-scale ecological assessment of design works. And we're calling this, I don't have it down here, but I'm calling it the Looking Glass Project. And so we'll see whether that comes out or not, or we are trying. So where do you go from here? Well, there's a lot of things that can happen. We've got faculty research grants. We are doing that. We're sort of done with that because this was funded out of the strategic planning grant, which ends next June. And so that piece is finished. We are partnering with other firms. I show you the Mahan Reichel connection. We want to develop some internships, and that hasn't happened necessarily yet, but we do have the connections for that. We've done some speaker support. We're working on the podcast as we go, and beginning to at least develop some ideas for what the graduate certificate or option might be. We have some developing partnerships with other universities. And I think we are more and more successful in bringing these concepts, these ideas into the curriculum. We'll leave that to the students to decide, I suppose. And really what we want to do is the final one, bringing design into the forefront of ecological research and education. I find that the designers and the artists are far more willing to accept the scientists than the reverse. Now, Bill's had good success, as he mentioned earlier, with the nurses. I need to find the same sort of success with the ecologists, and we're working on it. By being with some of those groups, especially the Landscape U program, it is becoming obvious that design has a strong place in a lot of this research. And I want to end with this particular thing. Now, I'm sure as you look at it, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And I want to talk through this. And this sort of flips me over the edge and gets me to things we need to do better. This is the intersection of Tipton and Grazierville down on I-99 south of here, just north of Altoona, but south of here, south of maybe 20 miles. And the river you see is a little Juniata flowing from the bottom of the picture toward the top in the direction of the arrow. And just to the left of that arrow is a wetland mitigation site. When Interstate 99 went up the ridge, they destroyed a lot of groundwater seep wetlands. And what they put in place were these large ponded areas down in the valley. Now, if you're going to put something in the ground, my ecologist in me says at least make it behave like it's supposed to be something where you place it. And the idea was to make this what's called a floodplain wetland, where when the stream floods, the adjacent areas get wet, and then throughout the year, then they dry down, and you ultimately get a forest. Which means that if you're going to do that, you want to put an entrance to that site towards the bottom of that arrow. What they did was put the only entrance right there with that little star at the top of the arrow. The only way water gets in at all, if ever, is if there's a major flood and it backs in. That will not get you the floodplain forest that this site needs. This site was missing what I would substantially call an integrative view of ecology plus design. The design was simply to put a hole in the ground. The ecology was missing. And so I'll leave you with that. This is the kind of thing that doesn't keep me awake at night, but bugs me. So let's do better than this. And that's where I want to end today with talking about E+D. And I'm happy to take any questions that might come up. Thank you.